To be honest, I'm wondering. Should I get your bag in case your phone's? Have you got your phone in your pocket?
Yeah.
In your pocket?
Yeah. Other action.
Welcome to Television Centre Wood Lane. My name is Esme and I will be your guide around this working building.
Other action.
Welcome to Television Centre Wood Lane, the world's first multi-studio complex. My name is Esme and I will be your guide.
And action.
Welcome to... Oh, fuck no. Welcome to Television...
No, you have to do it again. You need to pause, otherwise you can't edit it.
I need a script. I'm finding it really difficult.
All over. And action.
Welcome to Television Centre Wood Lane, the world's first multi-studio complex. My name is Esme and I will be your guide. Journey around this working building. I know.
And action.
Welcome to Television Centre Wood Lane. My name is Esme and I will be your guide on this magical journey around the world's first multi-studio. Yeah, excellent. Thanks. Bye. Bye. Okay.
And action.
Well, here we are at the BBC News Centre, the largest news gathering broadcaster in the world. What you can see through here is 62...
Okay, I want you to stop just to say, and action.
Well, here we are at the BBC News Centre, the largest news gathering broadcaster in the world.
Action.
Behind me is £62 million worth of news centre. If you'd have looked through this window, May 1998, all you would have seen would be carpeted floors and painted walls. By November of the same year, it was home to over 650 workstations and over 1,500 journalists. Pause there.
And action.
This area here is the heart of the news gathering organisation. It is here that the international and home news editors sit, collating information from across the globe from various press associations such as TASS and Reuters. The computer screens they're sitting in front of are called the electronic news production systems, and they contain text.
Okay, cut. And action.
This area here is at the heart of the news gathering organisation. It is here that the international and home news editors sit, collating information from across the globe from various press associations such as TASS and Reuters. The computer screens that they're looking at are called the electronic news production systems, and they contain text, visual images, some digital material as well, and eventually they will be able to edit on this particular piece of equipment. Behind them, on the screens, they're keeping an eye on the competition, such as Sky, CNN, but we are the largest news gathering broadcaster in the world. Significantly, CNN is only 2/3 our size. The clocks, they show the times from across the globe, from London, Jerusalem, Moscow, New Delhi and Hong Kong. So when we're phoning up our correspondents, we're not waking them up in the middle of the night. This balcony, you can see up here, may be familiar, and you'd be right. This balcony, do you want me to carry on? Or?
Yeah, no, that's...
Okay.
And action. Action.
You might recognise the balcony behind me, and you'd be right. It is the backdrop for the 1, 6 and 9 o'clock news. However, got bad news. Hugh Edwards doesn't sit here, but he sits in a studio with a screen behind him, and this image of the balcony is computer generated onto this screen. The camera that records this live footage is actually just over there, so it is all live footage. However, you will notice that the balcony behind me is just a quarter of a semicircle, and if you watch the news at the end, it is a whole semicircle. What they do is they mirror the image to make it look twice as big as it really is. So you're learning all the little tricks today. Over here, this is where I think I should get up here. Should I or not?
And action.
You might recognise the balcony behind me, and you'd be right. It's actually the backdrop for the 1, 6 and 9 o'clock news. However, I've got bad news. Hugh Edwards doesn't actually sit up here, but he sits in a studio with a screen behind him, and this image is computer generated.
And action.
You might recognise this balcony behind me, and you'd be right. It's the backdrop for the 1, 6 and 9 o'clock news. And I've got bad news. Hugh Edwards isn't sitting above us, but he's sitting in a studio with a screen behind him.
And action.
The balcony is actually recorded live from this camera up here.
No, what I meant, stop. And action.
Not some of you, you might...
Okay, stop. Action.
You might recognise this balcony behind me, and you'd be right. It's the backdrop for the 1, 6 and 9 o'clock news. However, Hugh Edwards doesn't sit here, but he sits in a studio with a screen behind him. And this image is computer generated behind him. And it's actually filmed with this camera just up there. However, if you look more carefully, the observant people amongst you...
No, stop. And
I don't know where I'm
action.
going from. Where am I going from?
Stop the top.
Okay.
Action.
You might recognise this balcony behind me, and you'd be right. It's the backdrop of the news at 1, 6 and 9 o'clock news. However, Hugh Edwards...
No, stop. You said the news up. And action. And action.
You might recognise this balcony behind me, and you'd be right. It's the backdrop from the news at 1.
Action.
You might recognise this balcony behind me, and you'd be right. It's the backdrop for the news at 1, 6 and 9 o'clock. However, Hugh Edwards doesn't sit here, but he sits in a studio with a screen behind him, and this image of the balcony is computer generated onto this screen. It's actually filmed by this camera here, just behind me.
And action.
You will notice that this balcony behind me is just a quarter of a semicircle. And on the back of the news at 1, 6 and 9, you'll notice it's a whole semicircle. What they actually do is they mirror the image to make it look twice as big as it really is. So you're learning all the little tricks today.
And action.
BBC News Centre is actually called Baird Media Centre. This is because it houses the international and local radio and television news. What used to happen is, in the olden days, the radio news used to come from Broadcasting House, the television news used to come from here. And what we found was we were sending out two teams to cover one story. So now, just one team is sent out and covers one story. And that package is used in varying lengths. For News 24, our 24-hour news service, the whole package of 20 minutes might be used. The audio of that same report might be used for Radio 5 Live, and it might be used for 1, 6, and 9 o'clock news in a shorter package. So it's quite an exciting first for the news.
And action.
BBC News Centre is actually called a Baird Media Centre. This is because it houses the international and home radio and television news. For the very first time, radio and television news is coming from the same centre. What used to happen in the olden days is that the radio news used to come from Broadcasting House and the television news used to come from here. Sorry.
And action.
Well, here we are at the News Centre. The News Centre is actually called...
Stop. You've already said that.
I don't know why I said that.
Action.
The News Centre is actually called a Baird Media Centre. For the very first time in 60 years, radio and television news is coming from the same centre. What used to happen in the olden days is that radio news used to come from Broadcasting House and television news used to come from here. What we found was we were sending out two teams to cover one story. Now what happens, one team goes out and covers that same story. That package can be used in various lengths. For instance, the whole package of 20 minutes can be used for News 24. The audio from that same report can be used for, say, Radio 5 Live. And then an extra down version of the same report can be used for news at 1, 6 or 9 o'clock. It also has our celebrities. For instance, Moon in the olden days would have to go to Broadcasting House for an interview there for radio, then get in a taxi and come across the whole of London and then be interviewed here for television. Now Peter Anderson can just come over here and be interviewed for radio and television. Of course, really, it should be called the Chinese News Centre, because of course BBC broadcasts online as well. Over with the Hamilton train crash, there were over 3 million hits to that one particular site.
Looking over there. And action.
And as you can see, coffee is a major feature amongst the broadcast journalists. In order to cope with all the stress of deadlines, lack of sleep and general pressure. If you look through there, none of them are smiling. No, I can't see you cut.
That was good though. No, okay. And action.
And as you can see, coffee is a major feature amongst broadcast journalists, in order to keep them awake, help them to meet those busy deadlines, long hours, lack of sleep, and so on. Lots of crap, but anyway.
And action.
And as you can see, coffee is a major feature amongst the broadcast journalists in order to help them to meet those busy and hectic schedules and tight deadlines of live news broadcasting.
Action. No. Stop. And action.
And here we are at the News Centre. The News Centre is actually called Baird and they go and create a package lasting approximately 20 minutes. This full report we use for News 24. The audio from the same report can be used, for instance, for Radio 5 Live, or the smaller edited down version can be used for News at 1, 6 or 9 o'clock. It also saves our celebrities a lot of time and energy. For instance, Peter Mandelson, excuse me.
And action.
Here
No, you have to stop.
No.
Action.
Here we are at the News Centre. It's called a Bimedia Centre because it houses the international at-home radio and television news for the very first time in 60 years. What used to happen is that the radio news used to come from Broadcasting House and television news used to come from here at TVC. It still does, but the radio news comes from here as well. What used to happen in the olden days is that one team, the radio team, was sent out from Broadcasting House. I've already said that, shit, sorry.
And action. Cut. Action.
Well, here we are at the News Centre. The News Centre is actually called a Bimedia Centre. This means it houses radio and television news for the very first time in 60 years. What used to happen is that radio news used to come from Broadcasting House and television news used to come from here.
And action.
Well, here we are at the News Centre. It's a Bimedia Centre. That means that it houses radio and television news for the very first time in 60 years. What used to happen is that radio news used to come from television centre. Oh, shit. There's already too much cleavage.
Where are you?
That looks so funny. Well, here we are in the hub, or the Concrete Doughnut, as Terry Wogan once called it. You may recognise it. It is, if you like, the face of the BBC. Do you want me to... Well, here we are in the hub, or the Concrete Doughnut, as Terry Wogan once called it. You might recognise it as the face. Well, here we are in the hub, or the Concrete Doughnut, as Terry Wogan once called it. It is, if you like, the face of the BBC. Many famous programmes have used this area. For instance, Morecambe and Wise did a funny dance along here. Roy Castle did a tap dance with 1,000 children tapping away. It also appears frequently on Blue Peter and Live and Kicking. It's quite a funny story about the shape of Television Centre. Or should I just do the fountain?
I love it.
I've got to do this quietly because I'm causing us. Well, here we are in the hub, or the Concrete Doughnut. Well, here we are in the hub, or the Concrete Doughnut, as Terry Wogan once called it. Morecambe and Wise did a funny little dance around here. Do you want to see it?
I love it.
Well, here we are in the Concrete Doughnut, or the... Oh no, sorry. Well, here we are in the hub, or the Concrete Doughnut, as Terry Wogan once called it. Morecambe and Wise did a funny little dance around here. Roy Castle appeared here with 1,000 children's feet tapping away for record breakers. This area often appears on Blue Peter and also on Live and Kicking. And as you can see, it's a working fountain. Oh no, it isn't, and there's a very good reason for that. If you look up here, this area is all in a circle, rather like a Greek amphitheatre. So instead of the gentle trickle of water cascading from here, it sounded like the Niagara Falls, which is a bit of a shame because Graham Dorbarney, or T.B. Huxley Jones even, the architect for this particular fountain, had wonderful sketches of all the BBC staff washing themselves in the fountain over lunchtime after they'd been in the sweaty studio. This area below here, there are actually offices down here. But what used to happen in the olden days is transmission area. For instance, there might be an orchestra in Studio 1 over here and a ballet in Studio 8 over here. And then what they would do is run the cables underground and they would meet in the middle, and this area here would be the transmission area. This is signified at the bottom here by two of the statues. There's a lady here holding a lyre representing sound, and on the other side there's a lady holding a mask representing vision. And out at the top there, at the top of that 40-foot plinth, is Helios, the sun god, shining his rays of light across the world, rather like the BBC.
And action.
The foundation stone for Television Centre was actually placed in 1956. Television Centre started broadcasting in 1960. The design of the building itself has an interesting story.
Cut.
That's crap, isn't it?
And action.
The foundation stone for Television Centre was placed in 1956. Television Centre started broadcasting
Cut.
4 years later.
Action.
The foundation stone for Television Centre was placed in 1956 and started broadcasting in 1960, just 4 years later. As you can probably tell by the architecture that it was of 1950s-60s design.
Cut. Action.
We're sitting here in the hub, which gives us an opportunity to look at the architecture. Built by a man by the name of Graham Dorbarn. The foundation stone laid in 1956, completed and started broadcasting in 1960. It's quite a funny story connected about the design of the Television Centre. If you were to look at Television Centre from an aerial view and look down, you will see that it's in the shape of a question mark. And there's a very good reason for this. Graham Dorbarn was sitting in a pub with an old envelope and drew a question mark on a piece of paper. How am I going to build the world's first multi-studio complex? How am I going to do it? We still have this old envelope to prove it. You looked back at this old envelope with this question mark a couple of jars later. I thought, do you know what? That's not a bad design at all. And if you look, this area here is the hook of the question mark, Studio 1 around to Studio 8, and this area down here is the leg of the question mark. And the new reception, completed in 1998, is, if you like, the dot at the end of that question mark.
Action.
Welcome to the hub, or the Concrete Doughnut, as Terry Wogan once called it. This area behind me is, if you like, the face of the BBC.
Action.
So up to the top of this 40...
Do it again.
Okay.
Action.
So bursting out of the top of this 40-foot plinth behind me is Helios, the sun god, shining his rays of light across the world, rather like the BBC, which rather neatly brings me along to the history of the BBC. What does the BBC stand for? British Broadcasting corporation. It used to be a company founded in 1922. Radio manufacturers came together because they wanted to sell more radio sets. But how were they going to do it? Between 1922 and 1924, radio broadcasting was actually banned completely. This is because the British government looked across the sea to the United States.
Try action.
The BBC came together in 1922. Originally, it didn't stand for the British Broadcasting Corporation, but the British Broadcasting Company. 6 radio manufacturers came together because they wanted to sell their radio sets. But how were they going to do it? They needed something to broadcast. This was slightly problematic because the British government had banned radio broadcasting. This is because they looked across to America and saw what was happening there, something called the American chaos. If you were sitting in a hotel room in New York, back in 1922, you wouldn't have been able to listen to one station because they all kept interrupting each other. And so the British government went to the other extreme and they banned broadcasting completely. It was actually an offence. But as I said, in 1922, the BBC came together and formed the British Broadcasting Company. It became a corporation in 1926 when John Reith came along and took the BBC by storm. He was a Presbyterian man, a Scottish man, a moral man, a very forthright man, a force to be reckoned with, and he laid down the 3 pillars that we still try to adhere to today, which is to educate, to inform and to entertain. Another relevant person in the BBC's history is a chap by the name of John Logie Baird. He was a bit of a mad inventor to say the least, but
action.
And another very relevant person in the BBC's history is a chap by the name of John Logie Baird. Trained at Glasgow Technical College along with John Reith, however a totally different character altogether. Whereas Reith was a businessman, Baird was an inventor, and a bit of a mad inventor at that. He did things like take socks from the army, cover them in tarmac and then try and sell them back to the army as waterproof socks. He was a sickly man, and his doctor advised him, in order to alleviate his depression, to go to the West Indies.
Is it what?
Sorry.
Action.
Another very relevant person in the BBC's history is a chap by the name of John Logie Baird. Trained at Glasgow Technical College along with John Reith, but a totally different personality. Whereas Reith was a bit of a businessman, Baird was a bit of an inventor, and a mad inventor to say the least. He did things like take socks from the army, cover them in tarmac and then try and sell them back to the army as waterproof socks. He was a sickly man and suffered from depression, and his doctor advised him to go and take a holiday, have a rest, go to the West Indies. Whilst he was there, he noticed that there was lots of sugar cane and lots of fruit, and he thought, yes, that's it, that is how I'm going to make my first million. So he made up lots and lots of jam. However, unfortunately, he forgot that these fruit all contained horrible little bugs, and he had to chuck all of the jam away. It's quite a tragic story, really. His widow, who was left behind when he passed away, was living in rented accommodation, cooking off a 1-hob stove, which is very tragic when you think how many people today have television sets, and what a kindly man he was. I spoke to one of his apprentices the other day who worked with him during the war on all his various exciting experiments, and he'd do things like give young apprentices £0.50 to go back into the room because the heat given off by television was so strong, everybody kept passing out in the early days.
Okay, cut. Action.
Of course, television really took off in 1953, the Queen's coronation. Around this time there were 10 or 11 people around a television set. The viewing figure... Oh, sorry, do that big.
And action.
Of course, television didn't really take off until 1953, the Queen's coronation, where there were 10 or 11 people around...
Cut. And action.
Of course, television didn't really take off until 1953 and the Queen's coronation, where there were 10 or 11 people around a television set, and there were approximately 18 million viewers. That's approximately how many people you get per episode of EastEnders these days.